Neuromuscular adaptations to exercise. Skeletal muscle adaptations to physical conditioning have generally been divided into those that occur as a result of the performance of either resistance or aerobic endurance exercise. The text that follows emphasizes the major adaptations in skeletal muscle to these distinct types of conditioning and how these responses relate to enhanced performance. Adaptations to resistance training. One of the fundamental adaptations to resistance training is an increase in muscle mass. This occurs by enlargement of muscle fibers, hypertrophy, not by an increase in their number. The benefit of increased cross-sectional area of the muscle fibers is increased ability to develop force. Among a group of athletes, maximal isometric force of the knee extensors, for example, is highly correlated to cross-sectional area of the quadriceps muscle group. Muscle fiber hypertrophy does not occur uniformly between two major fiber types. It has been shown in several studies of conventional resistance training that fast twitch fibers show a greater increase in size than slow twitch fibers. In fact, it has been argued that the ultimate potential of hypertrophy may reside in the relative proportion of fast twitch fibers within a given person's muscles. Thus, people who possess a relatively low proportion of fast twitch muscle fibers may have a limited potential for significantly increasing muscle mass with resistance training. Difference in muscle fiber composition and number may partially explain the marked variability among athletes in their hypertrophic response to conditioning. Most studies of hypertrophic response to resistance training have been conducted on males. Several recent studies, however, have shown that females can also enjoy impressive increases in the cross-sectional area of muscle fibers as a result of heavy resistance training. In fact, relative increase in muscle fiber types in response to short-term training has been found comparable between males and females. And side note, and even in older populations. Even though this may not be visually obvious because of the inherent general proportion of body fat in females, nevertheless, it seems that enhanced athletic ability afforded to males as a result of resistance training can in large part be enjoyed by females as well. The extent of hypertrophic response to resistance training is influenced by the time course of training. Increase in strength during the first 1 to 2 months of conditioning performed by previously sedentary people are usually not accompanied by muscle fiber hypertrophy. Consequently, it has been suggested that neural factors must adapt in some way to allow increased expression of strength. These neural adaptations actually result in less muscle being used to lift a given submaximal load during the early course of training. As a result, greater loading is imposed per unit of muscle, thereby gradually evoking hypertrophy. After 6 to 8 weeks, muscle fiber hypertrophy becomes obvious and clearly contributes to increase in strength. It is more difficult to demonstrate marked increases in muscle size and strength in weight-trained athletes. Athletes studied during 2 years of heavy resistance training showed increase in strength that paralleled optimization of training intensity, although muscle fiber hypertrophy contributed little to increased lifting performance. Thus, neural factors must again account for the improved performance accordingly. The contribution of conditioning to optimal performance can be realized only if intensity is maximal. Resistance training does not enhance an athlete's maximal aerobic power. It does not appear, however, to impair the muscle's ability to develop maximal aerobic power. In fact, concurrent performance of resistance and aerobic endurance training does not abate the extent of the positive adaptations of aerobic endurance training. When competitive distance runners added lower body resistance training to their conditioning programs, several aspects of short-term aerobic endurance actually improved. Although the mechanisms responsible for this response have not been identified, it appears that resistance training may increase distance runners or cyclists' ability to sprint at the end of the race. Anaerobic or fast glycolytic power seems to play a role in max VO2, or your ability to flush lactic acid, perhaps. Just thinking out loud. Adaptations to resistance training are specific to the type of exercises performed. Moreover, resistance training has no meaningful impact on aerobic power. Adaptations to aerobic endurance training. One of the fundamental adaptive responses to aerobic endurance training is an increase in the aerobic capacity of the trained musculature. This adaptation allows the athletes to perform a given absolute intensity of exercise with greater ease after aerobic endurance training. More impressively, after training, it may be easier for an athlete to exercise at a greater relative intensity of a now higher maximal aerobic power. Thus, measuring an athlete's maximal oxygen uptake before and after aerobic endurance training may not accurately portray his or her ability to perform during competition. For example, an athlete who can run a marathon pace equal to 75% of her maximal oxygen uptake after training may be able to maintain a pace that is 80% of her maximal aerobic power. This adaptation occurs as a result of glycogen sparing, less glycogen used during exercise within the muscle, which prolongs performance and reduces lactic acid buildup. Moreover, increases fat utilization contributes to glycogen sparing. The increase in the aerobic capacity of skeletal muscle that occurs after aerobic endurance training is experienced by both fast and slow twitch muscle fibers. Slow twitch muscle fibers have an inherently higher aerobic capacity than fast twitch fibers and are preferentially recruited during aerobic activity. However, if the intensity is sufficient, as in running repeated 800-meter intervals, fast twitch fibers, especially type 2B, also make a significant contribution to the effort. Under such conditions, their aerobic capacity also increases with training. The concurrent performance of intense aerobic endurance and resistance conditioning compromises the extent of the increase in strength that would have occurred if only resistance training had been performed. Thus, it does not seem wise to require strength and power athletes to perform intense aerobic endurance training. It has also been shown that elite aerobic endurance athletes, after cessation of training, actually show increases in muscular strength and power. Although aerobic endurance training increases aerobic power, it does not enhance muscle strength or size. In fact, intense aerobic endurance training can actually compromise the benefits of resistance training. Conclusion. The fundamental unit of muscular performance in humans is the motor unit. The generation of force provided by a given motor unit depends on the frequency in which the stimulated and the type of the size of the muscle fibers themselves. A muscle is made up of numerous motor units. Gradation and force in the muscle is achieved through variations in frequency of stimulation and number of motor units activated. The type and size of fibers in the activated units determine the speed and force developed by the muscle. Adaptations to resistance training are specific to the type of exercises performed. Explosive training evokes marked increases in muscular power, whereas more conventional heavy resistance training increases muscle size and strength. Neither type of training has meaningful impact on aerobic power. Resistance training, nevertheless, can be used to improve the kick that endurance athletes need at the end of the race. Aerobic endurance training, in contrast, increases aerobic power. It does not enhance strength or muscle size. Intense aerobic endurance training, in fact, may actually compromise resistance training and induced increases in strength and muscle size when two weak modes of training are performed simultaneously. Maybe that kick that the endurance athletes get from anaerobic training or strength training is muscle recruitment patterning. Just thinking out loud. Well, that's chapter 2.